Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart, and with the launch of Bolt Action version 3, I thought it'd be fun to do a really quick, easy paint video on how to paint one of these.
Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Baron of Dice, premium wargaming dice. Over 500 styles, over 4,000 customer reviews. Welcome to the best dice on the planet. Now you get one of these in the new starter box. I picked one up on its own for about £20 and it's pretty good value for what you get in the kit. You get sort of 2 footprints of ruined houses. No instructions in the box, but they're pretty basic frames, so they're very easy to work out from the pictures how it all goes together. So I set about clipping off the parts from the frame, filing away at the mould lines, which are just around the centre of the whole piece, all the way around. And before I knew it, I had them all built. And you can probably build these in quite a few different configurations. I went with the configurations that are on the outside of the box. Now I've primed these in matte black using a rattle can. My go-to brand at the moment is High Coat Matte Black, which I pick up on Amazon for around the £7 mark. It's great stuff, good value, seems to do the job pretty well. Now I'm not going to be using an airbrush, which is usually where I would head to now. So I'm going to be using some dry brushing techniques on these. And we're starting with Death Reaper and then Dungeon Stone from the Tooth and Coats range. Now I'm using a new style dry brush here. Well, I say new style, these have been around for a few years. Started with Artist Opus. The ones I have here are from Amazon. I also have some from Knott's Hobbies, which I'll also be using on this. And the dry brushing board you see in front of me, that piece of wood, is from Knott's Hobbies as well. And the idea here is that I rub it off onto the board, taking most of the paint off before I apply it in circular motions onto the miniature. Now using the board rather than using something like a piece of paper or a tissue or something like that means you're less likely to transfer any of those little figments or fragments of tissue paper onto your miniature, and I find it works quite well. We all have our own ways of dry brushing. Use your own methods if you've been dry brushing for years, but I do quite like the way this works. And this board, it picks up some texture after a while. You can almost test out the way it's going to look on the miniature by dry brushing it onto a dry part of the board as well. So we're on to that next stone layer now, that lighter colour, and just going with a second pass, carrying on with that steady dry brushing effect all over the whole miniature. You can see here the difference between the darkest grey and when you've added that second tone there, and then I continue that dry brushing again over the whole miniature on the larger piece as well, covering all of the wood areas as well. Now it's time for a lighter grey. This is kind of Pterodon grey, also from the Tooth and Coats range. Now all of these paints in the Tooth and Coats range match very well to Citadel, and if you go to the Transatlantic Games website, they have a lovely conversion chart on there. So if you're a user of Citadel paints, you can see how these match up, but I definitely recommend getting hold of them if you can. Again, carrying on this dry brushing here, very little on the brush at all, really just picking out the detail and lightening it very, very slightly. This works super well when we get back to that wooden area, really picking out that wood grain, because we're going to have some glazes afterwards, so picking out as much detail here as possible really, really helps. And this is all pretty easy to do. That detail really starts to come out with that final layer. And I must admit, it's been a while since I've just done this through layer after layer. I usually go to the airbrush, and I probably will do by choice in the future, but I really wanted to demonstrate how you could paint this building without using an airbrush. So this is Garagak Sewer from the Citadel Contrast range. I'm just going to apply this straight out of the pot over all the wooden areas, and this is where that dry brushing shows through now. Because this paint is slightly water-based or thin, you use it a bit like a glaze, and it shows through all of that lovely dry brushing. This effect continues on the planks on the inside of the building as well. Trying to be careful not to get it on the stone areas, but it doesn't matter if you get the odd little splash. You can always clean it off with a clean wet brush and a little bit of water, or just cover it with a little bit of weathering afterwards. There's also some areas that look a little bit like wooden beams in the rubble at the bottom, and I decided to paint these as wood as well. Here I'm using a little bit of contrast gore grunter fir, just a slightly different colour on the chimney pot. So we're going to do some sponge effects now, some stippling on with sponge, and this is from Knott's Hobbies. This sponge is quite dense, a little bit denser in its texture than the kind of sponge you get in your blister packs, and the holder is from Knott's Hobbies as well, and we're using Griffin Claw from Two Thin Coats, which is a kind of an off brownish white. By sponging on like this, you get this really nice texture, and I'm going to be building up by 3 colours here just to kind of build up the idea of some render on the outside of this ruined cottage. And if you're interested in the sponging holder as well as the sponge, there's a link to Knott's Hobbies in the video description below, and you get a 5% discount. You can actually be quite precise when you're sponging like this, and you can cut your sponges to the size you need. Now obviously there are regular shapes on here, so I'm not too worried if I go over slightly onto another bit of stone. It really doesn't matter. It's obviously painted render anyway, so there will be bits of paint on other areas of the building, but it's very easy just to go and dab this on. Anyone could do this. Even if someone who's never painted a miniature before, you could show them this technique in a few seconds and get them to go and do it. It just shows how easy it is to get a nice effect using some really simple techniques like dry brushing and sponging. So now moving on to Ivory Tusk for that second layer of the sponging. So it's slightly whiter in the mix here. Again, I'm just trying to leave a little bit of that previous colour showing through in places, so it looks like the rendering is a little bit stained and dirty, just builds texture into the colour. And as I work my way around the render on both pieces of the ruined farmhouse, you just see it really start to take effect. And then for the final layer, it's Trooper White. There's 2 whites, I believe, in the Two Thin Coats range. This is the slightly creamier of the 2. And again, this is just a perfect final stage. Now here, I'm actually using a little bit of sponge that you would find in a blister pack or in the packaging of your miniatures. It's got far more grain and texture to it because I want to stipple this on even more. This is the kind of sponge I'd use for chipping or something like that. For those of you who are used to doing that technique, if you're new to this completely, you may well have this kind of sponge in with the miniatures you've recently purchased. So just dappling this on, and it just keeps the texture of the previous 2 colours showing through rather than going over and obliterating it all. This is Vallejo Model Colour Deck Tan, and we're back to some dry brushing again. I've got hardly any on my brush here, and this is one of my Knott's Hobbies brushes, so very, very light and thin, lots of spray bristles, and I'm deliberately hardly leaving any paint on the miniature at all. I'm just working some of that detail back out again by going over the grain, which has slightly been covered by the layer of brown. The reason I did that is because I'm now going to add 2 very thin glazes of Mantis Warriors Green and Skeleton Horde. These are both contrast paints, but they're very low in pigment and very, very thin. So you can apply very, very thin layers here, and they don't add an awful lot of colour. So all it's doing is tinting what I've just dry brushed. You get rid of that chalky white look, but it's not completely covering that brown effect from before. So it just adds a little bit of extra value and a little bit of extra texture to the wood. Gives it more than just a plain brown look. Incredibly simple, nothing skillful here at all, just knowing what colours to use and where. So even if you're a very, very new painter, you'll be able to copy these techniques and have a really, really striking looking realistic wood. Now it looks like exactly the same 2 colours. It's not. The Mantis Warriors Green is the same, but there's also Agorash Dunes. Again, both Citadel contrast paints. What I'm doing here is just adding a little bit of staining to certain areas of the render and the stone. So I'm just adding a little bit of the colour to the side of the building, and then getting a clean brush or washing it off my brush and just blending it out a little bit. Starting it a little bit more advanced here, but I'm also just trying to demonstrate how easy it is to add these little bits of colour that are like staining on the stone or on the render without it being skillful at all, really. I'm just adding splotches of colour, quickly washing my brush off, and then just spreading it out a little bit and leaving it random, and it just adds some extra detail, adds some extra colour, and just makes the building look more weathered. Now at this stage they are absolutely ready for the table. In fact, they would have been ready before the last glazing stages as well, but I wanted to show how simple they were. But if you'd like to make them look even more weathered and even more realistic, I'm going to continue and show you how you can make these buildings look super good with just a few extra stages. Now you could turn to something like Agrax Earthshade here, but I'm not going to. I'm going to be using some oil washes, and these are ready mixed, and they're grease and dark mud through the Soilworks range from Scale 75. I'm also using some AK Fast Dry Thinner as well. The thinner is optional, and we'll come to that later, and an old brush. You definitely don't want to be using any of your new brushes. So I'm going with the darker mix of the two pre-mixed oil washes here, and I'm just letting it run in between the stones. And if you place it on the miniature with a bit on your brush, it actually runs into the detail itself. Now if you're using an Agrax Earthshade, it would likely stain the tops of the stones as well. It doesn't run into the recesses in quite the same way. Many people don't use oil washes, or they haven't tried them before, so you'll default to the Agrax Earthshade. Absolutely fine. I just think you need to be a little bit more precise, because once it's dried with the Agrax Earthshade, that's it, it will stay there. And the only way to lighten the centre of those stones again is to go back in and repaint them. But here, with the oil washes, they run into those recesses really, really well, but also they don't dry straight away, so you have the ability to clean them off. You have the ability to take it away off the top of a stone, and you can also have the ability to let it run into those areas a little bit more, and when it dries it also looks more weathered. So there's so many pluses for it. All you need is an old brush. You don't even need the thinners, you can do them just like I am here. So I move on to the grease colour here, which is the lighter tone, almost sepia tone. I'm just adding a few streaks. You can see it running down there. It doesn't matter, because I can just move it around with my brush, paint in some streaks, and I can go back and tidy it up later on. I'm just trying to show how easy oil paints are to use, and that they shouldn't be something that's seen as an advanced technique. There's no change in technique. In fact, they're easier to go back and fix your mistakes. So I think you need to be a far less better painter to make these work. Adding a little bit here into the sort of the crevices, into the recesses on the wood as well, because I know that I'll add extra weathering and detail, and then a little bit down the chimney breast as well. In fact, it's pretty much in all the recesses and all the areas of stone. Now what I'm doing here with a little bit of the clean thinners, and you want to use artist-based stuff like this, not the stuff you find in B&Q. Not only is it really smelly, the stuff you get in B&Q, it's also quite harsh as well. I've not needed to varnish my miniature here. As long as the paint was fully dry before you put your oil wash on, it's absolutely fine. What I can do now with oil washes, even though this is dry to the touch, I can go back with clean white spirit and just take it off anywhere I don't want it. So anywhere that's pulled a little bit too much or got a little bit of staining on the stone, I can go back and take it off with this clean white spirit. I can also add streaks in like I'm doing here. It will put a clean streak through, and what it leaves looks like rain marks and things like that. It works exactly the same on the render as well, so where it's a little bit thick, I can go back and thin out any marks where I feel that they've stained in a way that doesn't look realistic. Again, with a little bit of foam that I had in a blister pack here, I can dip that in the white spirit, squeeze off any excess, and I can use this as well, just to brush gently across the tops of those stones, and it'll take off any of the oil paint that's stained there, leaving it in the recesses. Just another way that you can remove oil paints. Now, on this model, I don't do this too often because I'm quite happy with how much oil paint is on there, and I'm happy using the brush to do it, but I really wanted to demonstrate how many different ways there are to work with oils. And here's a really good example of where it's run and pulled. And if that was Agrax Earthshade, that would be it. It would be stained like that. But I can go in with this clean white spirit and just thin out those marks and blend them out and make them look more realistic, rather than like there's a big splodge of paint on there. If I spent a bit of time, I could take pretty much all the oil wash back. But here I'm just taking away all of those big pools, and it looks so much better. And again, this is another jump off point. You could leave it as it is, and I think it looks even better. But we're going to be doing some more. So there's some mud effect. I'll come back to that in a moment, because first of all, I'm going to be using some dry pigment. This is light sienna colour, it's a kind of a dusty brown colour, and I'm brushing it into the detail around the edge of the miniature. Now I do this a lot, this is one of the things I like to do. I'm not going to seal this. You can get pigment sealer, it will change the way it looks. A lot of people don't like to do this stage, but I find it a really easy way to add some extra texture and staining to the bottoms of your miniatures. Great on your bases, it's great around the edges of miniatures like buildings or on tank tracks and things as well. Now I brush it in quite vigorously, and I blow away all the excess after all. And then you can also put it on wooden areas like this, and then if you really rub it in, it goes into that grainy detail, makes it look dusty and more realistic. And then, as I said, just blow away all the excess afterwards, and it's fine. It doesn't rub off, it doesn't come out.
And you can really see the difference between the bottoms of the building I've already done and the rubble pile and those that I haven't. I think it's well worth it. Then afterwards, I just come back in with the mud effect here. This is European mud from the Diorama FX range, and just splotch it along all the way around the bottoms of the building. And that way, when you put it on your gaming table, it looks like it's in the scenery and more realistic rather than floating on the top. And there we are, that's a finished ruined farmhouse for Warlord games. Bolt action or any other historical war game or even fantasy work very well for Warhammer Fantasy and things as well. Well, that was fun and super quick as well. Only took an hour or so to do in total. Really easy. I did miss my airbrush, but it's just because I'm used to painting that way. But I wanted to demonstrate how easy it is to do a building like this, even without an airbrush, of course, which doesn't come as a surprise to many people. But I also know there'll be lots of new people getting into bolt action, having picked up the new starter, especially with the new edition and all the excitement around that. And it's a really good time just to show people what you can do with simple techniques. Of course, I had to crowbar in some other things as well. Now, some people will see oil paints and pigments and glazes as advanced techniques, but hopefully by showing you how easy and how unprecise you need to be to use them, you can really slap things on and wipe them off and get great looking effects. And I think you can teach someone how to do those things without even having to have painted before. My wife doesn't paint miniatures. I'm pretty confident that I could show her all the techniques I've used there very easily, and that she could reproduce them no problem at all. There's no fine brushwork needed there. There's no fine airbrushing work needed there. It's pretty much slap it on and let the effects do the job, and that's what I wanted to demonstrate. And hopefully, even if you are an experienced painter, you may have seen the use of oils or the pigment or something that you haven't seen before, and now may be inspired to go away and give them a go yourself.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed the video, maybe found something useful there technique-wise, maybe something you've not tried before. Appreciate right at the beginning of the video is extremely simple dry brushing only, and I was very good to keep my airbrush switched off on this video. I know a lot of people like to see tutorials that don't include airbrushing. I make no apologies for using mine where it's the best thing to use, and I was very tempted to here, but I could also do a pretty good job just with dry brushing. And as this new edition of the game is out and people may be picking up the starter box with these buildings in for the first time, maybe they're new to wargaming, I thought they might be looking online, and to see something there without an airbrush with a bit of dry brushing would be a nice simple technique. Obviously, as the video progressed, I used more advanced materials. I still argue that the techniques are really easy, but things like oil washes, but I also provided alternatives to those. And hopefully, if you've not used oil washes before, you'll have seen the results and how easy they are to use, and maybe give them a go in the future. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.